and I'm going to leave room at quite a bit of space at the end for lots of specific questions if anyone happens to have any. So in terms of order of the presentation, first we'll look at the international regulatory environment for unmanned aircraft. Then we can look at the New Zealand environment. We can look at some of the types of operations that are happening. Probably the most important bit is looking at some of the considerations for people who are wanting to operate an unmanned aircraft, and also some potential areas for improvement in terms of how unmanned aircraft are regulated in New Zealand. So, start at the top. For those who, many of you will probably be familiar with this sort of layout, but the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, is a specialized body of the United Nations which creates standards and recommended practices for all sorts of different parts of aviation. So they have SARPs on things like navigation, maintenance, security, safety management, all sorts of different things. And all the ICAO signatory states, which basically means every country with an airport, because even North Korea is a signatory state to this particular convention, will create localized sort of regulations based upon those international standards. However, one thing that is quite unique with unmanned aircraft is there are no standards and recommended practices published by ICAO yet. There are some suggestions and there's working groups developing the things, but there is no set international standard. This is how you are to regulate the space of unmanned aircraft. And so that means that unlike most other aviation activities, unmanned aircraft regulation of unmanned aircraft is not very standardized across countries. Different countries have taken different approaches to the situation. However, looking across a huge number of countries, there are still some sort of common perceptions of what are the most risky types of operations, and therefore the ones that need to be more heavily regulated. So those first few acronyms there, VLOS refers to visual line of sight. So typically, if you can see the aircraft at all times while you're operating it, that's considered relatively low risk. However, what some operators do is they say, well, I'll train up visual observers, I'll put them at the periphery, and they will keep visual line of sight, but I won't have visual line of sight as the pilot, okay? And that's what we call extended visual line of sight. That's kind of medium risk, if you like. The real high risk one is, of course, beyond visual line of sight flight, which means no one is looking at the aircraft. It's either flying completely autonomously or through something like a first-person viewer. And so, the standards for that are obviously higher. Another way they divide them across different states is based on the weight of the aircraft, okay? So for whatever reason, 2 kilos and less is often seen as low risk. In New Zealand, we don't really make that distinction, but many countries do. Then you jump up to sort of moderate, so up to 25 kilos. That is quite a common one for where it gets really serious, so often requiring the aircraft to be registered as opposed to most unmanned aircraft, which you can just fly out of the box. And then that means sort of over 25 kilogram aircraft, there's a lot of considerations because you're supposed to operate them just like manned aircraft. Then you've got the spaces you choose to fly in. So a shielded area. So you're not flying above the height of trees or houses or things, which means there's no way you can interfere with manned aviation. That's always seen as low risk. In terms of going up to something like 400 feet or even higher, uncontrolled airspace is normally not seen as much concern. There's easy ways you can manage doing that safely. But then when you're wanting to go into controlled airspace and some types of special use airspace, such as low fly zones, where we know there's low flying manned aircraft, that becomes a higher risk thing. Then you've got people and property consider. So are you going to fly over your own property and you're not going to overfly anyone directly? That's good. That's low risk. You want to fly above people and property? Well, there's some risks there. We need to regulate that. And then there's often kind of a separate consideration if you want to fly above crowds or sensitive areas. So you want to be flying right next to a controlled airport, or you want to be flying above a stadium that's full of thousands of people, then that's another risk level again. Then I kind of just divide these ones into one of two categories. So night flying is seen as more risky than day flying, but it's not that hard to manage, so it's more just medium risk. Recreational use is normally lower risk than commercial use. We are quite often doing things like surveying power lines or something like that. There's normally inherently more risk. And also, are you just having a camera on this unmanned aircraft or some sort of sensor, or are you dropping stuff from the aircraft or spraying stuff from the aircraft? Because that requires special consideration. So while all of these regulations across the world have developed individually, what you'll find is some of these classifications are kind of used. There's some line in the sand on these particular variables where countries have said, no, we need some sort of special rules for that. So in terms of New Zealand, we have our Civil Aviation Act 1990, which gives the Civil Aviation Authority the power to create rule parts, okay? So this is localised legislation. And the CAA, in the absence of these international standards, I think 2015 was when they came out, created two rule parts. One already existed for remotely piloted aircraft, used for model aircraft and stuff, and that was Part 101. Part 102 was completely new. And so typically Part 101 is what your sort of low risk operators, that green column we looked at in the last slide, that's sort of where they normally fit. And anyone who's in the orange or the red columns is typically needing to be a Part 102 operator. And the key difference for that is Part 102 operators need to have specific procedures in place to manage those risks. Any one of you can be a Part 101 operator. You just go buy an unmanned aircraft, fly it under Part 101 rules, that's all fine. If you want to do anything outside of those 101 rules, then you need to become a certificated organisation, and that's a different kettle of fish. To give you an idea, these are just some of the common ones we come across at Massey. Part 101 is often people who just like doing a bit of photography, a bit of fun. People who are model aircraft enthusiasts. There are actual people who do drone racing. They often do it inside, so it's not causing any risk, but there are some pretty serious competitions for that now. And even things like fishing. So if you go into hunting and fishing, you'll see a drone that's specifically tailored for taking fishing lines out to where the fish are, and you can see with the camera where the fish are biting, so you drop your bait just in the right spot. And so you can see there's a number of potential recreational uses, and as long as you're following the right rules and procedures, that's all fine. Part 102, so you can be a professional photographer and not be under Part 102, but usually professional photographers want that ability so they can operate most places as opposed to being restricted. Aerial surveying is a really common one, so you fit them with some particular type of sensor, fly over forestry, farmland, that sort of stuff. Infrastructure inspections, so there's ones that are especially created to look at power lines, to look at tall buildings. And then top dressing is becoming one ever since the last couple of years. DJI, the main manufacturer of these things, created one just for top dressing. A lot of people bought them thinking this would be big business in New Zealand, didn't realise how hard it was to get the permission to do that. Nonetheless, these are some of the operations that we are seeing in New Zealand now. So these Part 102 operators, so let's say you want to go do something like fly next to airports or above people without their consent, well, you're going to need to be a 102 operator, okay? And what that means is you have to write a document called an exposition. Those who've worked in the industry are probably quite familiar with these, but for the sake of those who aren't from the industry, an exposition is basically a document that outlines how an organisation's managed and how its operations are conducted. It's very explicit. That exposition document is used by regulatory authorities to determine whether an organisation should be certificated under Part 102, and then is used by the regulatory authority to see, to audit that organisation to see if it's following its own procedures. That's more or less how it's used. To give you an idea of a Part 102 exposition, I've written several of them for different people. They've all been in that range of 40 to 60 pages. So we are talking about a pretty decent sized document full of procedures to do things. To give you an idea, I can't actually put any up because they're all for real companies, but to give you an idea of some of the key headings, you've got things like organisational management, standard operating procedures, emergency procedures, aircraft technical specifications, maintenance programs, safety management systems, and anything else that may be relevant to that particular organisation. So these are very well thought out documents, usually for operators that are doing quite serious stuff. So what are some of the key considerations that people look at and going, well, do I need 101, 102, and what sort of things would I need to write in terms of procedures if I wanted to go down that 102 route? So flight above people and property is probably one of the most contentious, because obviously a lot of people in the public are quite uneasy about unmanned aircraft for whatever reason. So basically you can fly over people and other people's property under Part 101, but you have to obtain consent before you do it. That's basically the rule. However, under Part 102, you can make a variation to that. And the most common one, rather than just going and doing it, is you normally need to notify them before or after that you're going to do it. They can't deny you consent, but you have to tell them so they can make complaints, or they can report you if you sort of start annoying them too much or whatever. Occasionally, you can even get the variation to just not tell anyone. You just fly it. It's all good. But yeah, there'd have to be a good reason for that. Typically, if you want to convince the Civil Aviation Authority that you should be able to fly above people and property without their consent, you would need a technological solution to make your technology low risk. And that's normally pretty straightforward. You buy a parachute, one for a DJI Phantom's about $200 US. And if you're dealing with a much bigger system, like some of them are bigger than I am, then you'd be looking at something like an automatic recovery system. So if one of the prop stops, it can automatically recover itself and that sort of thing. And that means that if there is a failure, we would hope that no one gets severely injured and no property gets significantly damaged. You reduce the risk. Airspace. So typically, there are a few exceptions, but typically, if you want to be in controlled airspace above 400 feet or use certain types of special use airspace, then you need a Part 102 certificate. And where am I? So often what that means is you need to develop procedures for issuing NOTAMs. So that can either be you let Airways know 24 hours in advance, or you can become an organisation that's actually allowed to issue NOTAMs. And for those who don't know that acronym, that's a notice to airmen. So it's just letting people know. So if you're a pilot, you're looking at your NOTAMs, you take off, you go, oh, someone's doing an operation, 2 kilometres north of Palmerston North Airport. And that way you'll look out for that if you're on approach. You're not going to be surprised that there's an aircraft operating there. Controlled airspace, you obviously need to get clearance from Airways. You can do that through airshare, even as a Part 101 operator, but as a Part 102 operator, you can get more sort of permissions to do things. But the interesting thing is that you don't normally you actually call whoever the air traffic controller is responsible, tell them when you're starting the operation, when you're stopping it. They don't want unmanned aircraft operators making radio calls, because first of all, they don't hold the right license. And second of all, they don't want to use up all of the radio frequencies with unmanned aircraft calls. They want to keep that more for unmanned aircraft. Obviously, the unmanned aircraft operators still need to understand radio frequencies. They learn that on courses such as the one Massey runs, and they would have a airband radio to listen to the radio calls. That way they know about manned aircraft in the area, and if they hear something of concern, they can stop operating. Now, the interesting thing with special use airspace, and this is one where I think perhaps the CAA has evolved on this in the last few years, is now you can basically go into most special use airspace as long as you can prove you can do the same thing as a manned aircraft would in that same space. So I had a client who lived over in the Wairarapa, and there's a low fly zone in this area he commonly needed to operate in. And theoretically, you're not allowed to fly your drone outside of a shielded area in a low fly zone, because we know there's aircraft coming low. But he's got procedures to go and talk to the using agency, so the flight club or whatever it is that runs it, to get a briefing and do all the same stuff that a pilot of a manned aircraft would. And now that's acceptable. But you have to write those procedures in. So that last point more or less covers off a lot of stuff. You just do what manned aircraft do, you'll be fine. Aerodromes is a bit of a funny one. You mentioned it before, David. Unmanned aircraft near aerodromes is one that quite often gets the media's attention. It sometimes is quite costly for airlines when they come landing at Ohakea instead of Auckland. But basically, if you're not in a shielded area, you shouldn't be operating within 4 kilometres of an aerodrome. or you're a Part 102 operator. There are some exceptions. A Part 101 operator can get permission to do that under certain sort of rules, but typically you're dealing with a Part 102 operator to do that. The most common issue, and this is Part 101 operators, the ones who don't have the procedures and stuff, is most people don't know what an aerodrome is. Because if you look at the definition under Part 1 of the rules, it's basically any bit of land or water that's used primarily for the takeoff, landing, and taxiing of aircraft. Okay, now that can include a lot of different things. So helicopter pads at hospitals are often forgotten. So we get people operating a drone in the CBD of Palmerston North, which is within 4K's distance of the hospital at Palmerston North, which has got a helipad, which means they're breaking that rule. Small strips for top dressing. Now there's something like 3,000 strips where you can land a top dressing aircraft in New Zealand. You should be aware of where those are. If it's not a one where you're expecting scheduled flights and stuff, you can still do it 101, but you need to call whoever the operator is, Ravensdown or Super Air or whatever, to check. And then lakes are theoretically aerodromes too. So Lake Taupo, for example, you can land an aircraft on it. So a 4K perimeter around Lake Taupo, if you're taking Part 101 exactly as it reads, is theoretically somewhere you can't go above a shielded area. Okay, now obviously no one's too draconian. I'm sure the CA probably don't enforce the Lake Taupo one entirely, but the thing is people don't understand what an aerodrome is, and that's often the biggest cause. If someone's flying right next to Auckland Airport, they're trying to be a douchebag. But I've seen people when I was down at the beach at Foxton going for a walk, and there's someone flying a drone nice and high, and that's very close to Foxton Aerodrome, and theoretically a plane coming into land there could have hit it. And that's the sort of stuff which it's clearly just a lack of knowledge that was the issue there. The visual line of sight stuff, I think I sort of alluded to before. So Part 101 means visual line of sight at all times. There is one provision that allows you to do it with a first-person viewer, but you have to have a visual observer right next to you, looking at it for you. Other than that, if you want to do extended visual line of sight, so the visual observer's at the periphery, or beyond visual line of sight, so no one's looking at it while it's flying, then you need to be a Part 102 operator. Now, extended visual line of sight is a relatively easy sort of thing to write procedures for. You just need to say how you're going to brief the people who are going to act as visual observers and have some sort of way of training visual observers so that they are competent to do that role. Beyond visual line of sight is probably the most difficult variation you could aim for under Part 102, and that's typically the case in every country. This is the hardest thing to do with unmanned aircraft. However, there are two solutions, usually across different countries. Whoops, apparently I didn't write them out on there. So first of all is a technological one. So if you have a fully autonomous aircraft that's equipped with stuff so it can automatically communicate with air traffic control, other aircraft, it has all the collision avoidance technology, all of that stuff, then yes, you can sometimes get that beyond visual line of sight approval. The regulatory one is an interesting one, which is you can have an area of restricted airspace that's for the purpose of testing beyond visual line of sight aircraft. There's a case of one up in Northland where they were wanting to deliver medical supplies across a harbour. Saves a 3-hour drive because you can take a drone there in about 20 minutes. And so they got given an area of restricted airspace where this agency could tell manned aircraft they're not allowed to enter it because we're testing beyond visual line of sight flight with unmanned aircraft. Now, obviously, to get that, the airspace can't be very busy airspace. You're not going to say, oh, we'll test parcel delivery over central Wellington. That's never going to happen. And it has to be sort of in the public interest. So obviously, there's a trade-off there where the Civil Aviation Authority goes, yes, there's a public good in having delivery of medicines to this remote hospital. So it can be done, but it's very difficult. Training. Part 102 operators need to be trained by an approved organisation, so a Part 141 organisation. There's about 4 in the country that can do that sort of training. Massey's, I imagine we're one of the busiest because we seem to have our courses booked out about 3 or 4 months in advance, but I'm sure the other ones are pretty busy too. That's also recurring training. So they can't just go once and be like, yep, I'm sorted. They've got to do it every 2 years. So it's not like a pilot's license where the certificate kind of can keep going. Visual observers normally can just be internally trained as long as you've got the right procedures for training them. Most 102 operators who are going to do extended visual line of sight do that sort of thing. So now you've had a look at some of those key considerations, you kind of get the idea of what a Part 101 operator and a Part 102 operator is. The question is, where does the risk lie in the system, the current system? So while Part 102 operators, they're doing those medium and high risk activities that we talked about many slides ago. And so those activities are greater risk. What you can see is that they have to have very clear procedures, technology, training to try and mitigate those risks. Okay. The other thing about Part 102 operators that's a bit different is they stake their livelihoods on being able to do that business. That is that if they crash a $120,000 unmanned aircraft, it's going to be more costly for them. And equally, if the CAA says, no, we're taking away your certificate to operate, that's going to be very costly to them too, financially. So there's a real incentive to actually play ball when it comes to the rules. Does the same apply for Part 101 operators, do we think? Now, before we go too far down that line, I'm going to tell you about a study that me and some of my colleagues worked on back in 2015. So this was a small study, took place in Palmerston North Levin in Wellington. We set up a table, we placed this unmanned aircraft on it, okay, pulled all the different bits out, here's the battery, here's the camera, sort of stuff. So people could pick it up, hold it, have a look at it. And we gave them some key stats. So this can fly for 20 minutes, take still shot pictures and achieve a height of 100 feet. And we asked people how much they thought it would cost to buy this aircraft. Anyone want to have a guess here?
Yeah, I bought it on AliExpress for about 30 bucks.
Oh yeah, very good, yeah. Problem is it's 2018 now. Back in 2015, people didn't know this. It was 75 bucks back then. But in 2015...
I thought that might be it.
I thought I might have that coming to a Royal Aeronautical Society. The general public in 2015 thought that that would be a $500 aircraft. And the reality was at the time it cost $75, once again, AliExpress. People, and that's 144 consumers, okay? So there's a few people who are kind of way out of the place, but that's the median price there. Why does that matter? Well, most people were obviously surprised by the real price of the aircraft. So there's about 15% of the population back then that actually knew that you could buy these on AliExpress for bugger all, but most people didn't know that. So most people were very surprised. And what happened was once they got all the real sort of prices for that and a few add-ons they could buy, you could see a lot of people said, yeah, I'd be likely to buy one at that price or very likely to buy one at that price. Now, obviously, intention to buy doesn't mean actually buying. It's not a reliable measure, but it's still quite a high figure, okay? So that's still giving you a ballpark figure. And based on that and looking at a number of general consumers in New Zealand, we estimated that there'd be 500,000 unmanned aircraft operators in New Zealand by 2025. Now, we sent this study to the CAA. We presented it to Air New Zealand. They were interested, published in Aviation News, so it'd be out of the way thing, and everyone thought we were nuts in 2015. According to MB, last year there was 185,000 drone operators in New Zealand, and it's only 2019. So it's one of those things where I'm going to show this to someone in 20 years' time and be like, you see. But you know, we're still going to be facing a big problem. Okay, 500,000 drone operators is a serious thing, and even if at a more conservative estimate, you know, we're already there, 200,000 operators essentially now in New Zealand. So what's the concern about that? Well, they're ordinary consumers, and most people who buy these things don't see them as unmanned aircraft. They see it as a toy. In fact, many people buy them for their children as a toy. And there's many other affordable aircraft. So that other one, you know, so yeah, you can buy it $50 on AliExpress or whatever it is. Okay, there's one that you can buy for about $200 on AliExpress that now can go up to 350 feet. It now weighs 2 kilograms instead. You know, that has much more potential for causing damage to aircraft and also being able to fly at a height that we're in the right place, a manned aircraft could potentially be operating. So that was kind of an extreme cheap end of it, but they're still not very expensive aircraft, ones that could potentially cause damage. And so in this article we wrote a few years ago, we suggested that the problem with how Part 101 works in New Zealand now is that these operators are unaccountable and uninformed. So in terms of unaccountable, let's say there's an aircraft flying near an aerodrome Okay, we've seen this situation play out in the media several times in the last sort of couple years. How do you know who's operating it? And if you catch them in the act, what's the penalty? Okay, well, the answer is you don't know who's operating it, because unlike Part 102 operators who have to make the aircraft identifiable, Part 101 operators don't. You just buy it, and as long as it's, it's not like one that's over 25 kilograms or something, you just go and fly it. Okay, that's how it works. So you don't know who's operating it. Now, if you did catch them in the act, let's say they were actually near the aircraft they're operating, which is often not the case when someone's being malicious and interfering with manned aviation. The penalty, in terms of a fine, there is potential prison sentence, but in terms of the fine, it's $10,000. Part 102 operator, it's $100,000. So once again, the penalties are markedly different too between the two. Now, looking at what's happening in other countries and what people are suggesting, there are some potential answers, and probably the easiest one is all RPAS be registered. Charge a fee that's basically bugger all, so no one gets too upset about it, and then you have a register. And that's what they've started doing in the United States. So the Federal Aviation Administration does this, but they have an exception for, I think, something like 200 grams and below, because 200 grams is never going to get high enough to interfere with manned aircraft. And probably, and this is probably up for debate, delegate that responsibility away from the Civil Aviation Authority, because they don't have the organisational resources to deal with 500,000 registered unmanned aircraft. But you could just use it the same as how we do with, say, motor vehicles. You go into the NZTA, the AA office, go to the post shop, do it online, something like that. So you ease the burden on the Civil Aviation Authority so they can focus on the Part 102 operators where their expertise better lies. The uninformed bit, and like I say, we saw this as a problem several years ago. This is the only part of aviation that's dominated by people who have no experience in aviation whatsoever, none at all. And so even if they're aware of the regulations, they probably still don't know how to interpret them, okay? So they're basically all round mostly uninformed. That is, they don't know they exist or they don't know what they mean. Typical thing, so how do you know where the nearest aerodrome is? You face that problem again. Where is a helicopter pad? How do you know where the helicopter pads are? How do you know where the lakes that you can land on are? How do you know where the top dressing strips are? How high is 400 feet? If you've never flown a plane, how do you have any perception of how high something is? Is it that building? Is it that building? You don't know. And what's airspace? And people don't know what that is. You talk about airspace. Okay, what's controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace? What's this special use airspace? They don't understand any of this stuff. And so basically, I think the answer here, and we suggested several years ago, is let's just produce an unmanned aircraft operator code that's written in simple language, not pilot talk, not air traffic controller talk, not the stuff that often the professions of people who work at the Civil Aviation Authority, but actually in the talk that people who are going to need to comply with the regulation understand. And so think of your road code in New Zealand. Very easy reading, lots of pictures, right? Teenagers read it and get away with it, so must be all right. And they set a very short theory test. So I think it was 30 questions or something you do to get your learner's license. You have to get 27 out of 30 correct to get it. Do a basic theory test like that. Once again, charge bugger all for it and use the resources of other organisations such as NZTA, RAeS, that sort of stuff. Treat it kind of like a motor vehicle. And that way, they have a little license. So you know who this person is, yes? And also they know what the rules mean and how to comply with them, okay? No one cares if they crash their aircraft on their own property while no one's around, okay? People do care if they're flying an aircraft dangerously next to an aerodrome or they crash into somebody or things that they shouldn't really be able to do if they're complying with Part 101. And so the issue is not so much that Part 101 is inadequate. You could rewrite the rule all you like. It's a problem that people can't be held to account for following that correctly or not, and that people don't actually understand what it means if they don't have previous aviation experience. And so I believe we can summarise. So there's no widely used international standards. Some regulators have tried, but of course there'll always be fight back amongst them. So until ICAO comes out with the set, we basically don't have a standardized international way of doing things with unmanned aircraft. So each country has developed their own regulations. And I should probably note some countries have decided not to implement any regulations to try and get the economic development. Rwanda is a classic case where they saw the benefit more. So they just said, no, do whatever you like. It's good investment for our country. New Zealand's regulations are working well for those medium and high risk operators. Part 102 is a good way of doing things. It has a lot of flexibility in what people can do. They just need to have thought out procedures to be able to do it safely. However, the risk in our current system is for these recreational Part 101 operators because they are uninformed about the rules, i.e. they either don't know they exist or can't understand them, and they can't be easily held to account because we don't know whose aircraft each one is, and we don't know who owns and operates them if they're doing it under Part 101. So that's the summary of unmanned aircraft regulation in 25 minutes instead of 3 days. So there you go. Hit me. Yes.
So I really like these ideas for how we can fix what's happening, but there was one weird part. When you said the unaccountability aspect, you mentioned that one solution would be to register drones at the time they're bought. What if, I assemble racing drones, so what happens if you don't just buy a drone, you buy 10 parts, you might break a few parts, replace it, and 6 months down the line, it's technically a different drone.
Well, the thing is that they, what you would normally do, so what Part 102 operators do, right, is they basically have to have some sort of tape on it. So they kind of make their own aircraft calls, right? So say I have a client that's AirCam Limited. So it's ACL1, ACL2, ACL3, or something like that. So if you just had a unique identifier, you could put that on any aircraft. So you're changing the parts around, no worries, you can do that under Part 101. Just stick the sticker on it every time, you'd be fine. But at least now if you got caught and we found this aircraft, you go, this code traces back to you.
And if you have 2 of them, you get another one, put it on.
Yeah. And each time it costs you $5 or something meaningless, so no one gets too upset about being a nanny state or anything like that.
Sweet.
I've got 84 model aircraft. Do I really have to pay $5 for every one to register?
But you're probably doing it through Model Aircraft New Zealand. And so the difference here is, and why Part 101 worked up until the point we got Part 101, the unmanned aircraft becoming a big thing, is that people like Model Aircraft New Zealand have always known how to comply with the rules. They make sure they do a good job of it. And so you'd probably have to have some exceptions put in there, particularly even with Model Aircraft New Zealand, there are some exceptions for things that you guys can do that would normally require Part 102 approval, but you don't need it, such as flying aircraft over a certain weight, I believe is permitted. Most 101 operators can't just buy one of that certain size and fly it like a lot of model aircraft.
No, we can certify up to 100 kilograms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if I was I want to fly it for fun, I can't buy anything over essentially 15 kilograms without having some sort of red tape put on me. So yeah, I think you'd keep that going basically because there's no risk in what model flight aircraft New Zealand sort of does. So yes.
Why license the aircraft and not the operator?
Well, the thing is that, you do both. You get a little theory test, you get a little license or badge or something that says you're allowed to fly unmanned aircraft, and that ensures you know what the rules are. The registering of the aircraft is just the easier thing because it's not like a motor vehicle where you can get pulled over, or a manned aircraft for that matter, where you can find the pilot in the plane. They're at a distance. So at least if you've got a unmanned aircraft and it's tied to some sort of license, you can track them down, then you've got accountability in the system.
Because I'd compare that, especially Albert's case of like building your own, to amateur radio. I don't know if there's any other amateur radio operators in the room. No? Okay. So to operate any radio transmitter, the transmitter has to be licensed. The only exception is amateur radio where the operator is licensed, because there's an assumption that they're going to be tinkering and building their own things, and so it's silly to try and license the radio because, as Albert said, you change out components and things. So the operator has a license, and they use that call sign, so you still identify it. So you can put the operator's number or whatever, for want of a better would on whatever aircraft you happen to be flying, but then you wouldn't have to register your 70 something
Yeah, yeah.
aircraft.
So that's basically a Part 102 operator does that, but also things like Model Flying New Zealand are examples of those sorts of operators where an exception's made. And so the answer is yes, you'd definitely be able to do stuff like that, but it'd be a matter of talking with the Civil Aviation Authority, having the right procedures so that whatever that approved organisation does is going to achieve the same level of safety as the system that's put in place for everyone else. So definitely, and probably in the case of drone racing, if you have like an indoor facility and that's the only place you operate it, probably don't need to register those. You can tinker with them while you're at it, because we know that they're contained in that environment, which is a safe environment to do things like drone racing. So definitely you would have some flexibility and exceptions around that. But for the people who go order one off AliExpress, like I did, and sounds like other people have, you know, just making sure that those people understand what they're getting into.
I can't think of a single example in the last 3 years of a drone being recovered in which, if it had had a registration number on it, they could have found the operator. Having a number on something which you can never catch is no help.
I think the crux of that is rules are only there if people want to abide by them.
Yeah.
But there's so many ways around this. How can you control, like, you know, Europe tried to geofence.
Yeah, yeah.
It works well, except for the people who know how to get around them or people buying them in that aren't through the registered users.
Mm.
You know, you talk about registering drones and that. You could put that in unless there's some mechanism for controlling them, stopping people from. And think about the actual practicalities of going around and trying to enforce people not to fly them, or you've got a small drone but you're not registered, therefore you can't. I don't think there's any practical solution to actually saying you cannot fly this, or I'm going to stop you, or you have to be registered for a 101. Because you think about, you know, you said about the numbers. I'll go on to AliExpress, I can go on wherever, I can go and buy them. It's that same thing, unless there's something there to actually say, or a method there to actually enforce it, and then try and think about enforcing. You talk about loading up CAA, who's going to do the
Well,
enforcing?
no, that's the point, is I would delegate all Part 101 things outside of the Civil Aviation Authority.
But who's going to,
Who's
what authority
paying for
can you
this?
give someone to go and enforce
Well,
thousands of people about whether or
Well,
not
New Zealand police can do it. If they see someone operating an aircraft, they can ask to see the license.
They won't investigate burglars.
they're only just doing murders.
They're only bad
Well,
ones.
It's not practical.
still
it's
have
just-
better-
It's,
they
co-
still-
it's going to cost money to enforce it.
Yeah.
Someone's going to pay it.
But I mean, that's a problem with our existing crime system. That's not the fault of this regulation being overly burdensome. The problem is, and this is the other way of looking at it. If you put in no regulation, right, what's going to happen is 4 or 5 years from now, there's going to be an incident. There'll be a collision between an unmanned aircraft and a manned aircraft. People will die. And there'll be a knee-jerk reaction, and they'll do something like what has happened with a lot of gun laws around the world, where they are excessively restrictive, and they don't take. And so you've got to find a middle ground. The most clear thing to me is that the CAA is not the appropriate. They write the rule, sure, they've got the expertise to do it, but they're not the right place to enforce it, which is how it is at the moment, and they are not the right place to be dealing with any sort of registration or seeing who's flying them, because they don't have the resources. Even Part 102, they lack it. At the moment, it takes 6 months before they even start looking at an exposition that's submitted. There's only 2 people who are on the Part 102 desk, essentially, at CAA, because it's user pays agency. So the question is, do we want to have no regulation and bear the risk of a knee-jerk reaction? Do we want to have a small amount of regulation so that the industry continue to grow, and therefore we reap the economic benefits of that growth?
Or third option is you put mechanisms in place to protect the high-risk areas like airports, and that way you've actually got a way of a risk assessment. Where is the high risk of impact of small ones on aircraft, and you've done a mechanism to actually control it and protect those areas.
So what, you're going to build stuff like that around every aerodrome in New Zealand?
You do it on a risk assessment basis.
Isn't there something that's fitted to drones, part of the GPS system, where if you're within a restricted area or an airfield, it won't start up?
Yeah, for the sophisticated ones. So all the ones from DJI do that, but the Seamers that you buy for AliExpress have nothing. They don't even have GPS mode or even ATI mode.
Graham's
Manually
wouldn't even
fly it.
come back to it.
Yeah,
So you laugh at police being able to enforce or being the ones to enforce those. But I guess I'll come back to the amateur radio example, because the amateur radio laws, or the radio transmission laws in general, say that if you own, like if you have in your possession a transmitter that you're not licensed for, or that isn't licensed, you're deemed to have used it, and so it can be confiscated from you. And so having the police be able to enforce it, because police now are called when people fly drones and people feel unsafe, they call the police. So the police being able to turn up, and even if you're not flying it, being able to say, do you have a license for that drone? No, and being able to confiscate it means that people will actually be more diligent about doing that.
I think too, though, you don't want to be too harsh on the penalties, because you can see how people might just not be aware of things, particularly with so many operators. And so, I mean, you would probably have similar things, when you get caught without your license, or you get caught with an unlicensed motor vehicle or something, the penalties are fine, a couple $100 or something. And you don't want to be too burdensome, but if there's enough of a threat that you might get caught, then that stops. There'll still be bad eggs. The problem is this wasn't seen as a major issue 4 or 5 years ago. Like I say, people were laughing, people outside the room, when you said, oh, look, there's going to be 500,000 people using these things in 10 years' time. The perception was completely different. And that would have been the chance to make sure before all of them were here that there could be some small, reasonable standards. But that's not the case. There's already 200,000 of them. So I get what you're saying. It's going to take a while, but once again, it's no regulation, or you could take a risk-based approach, but it hasn't worked in any of the places that have tried that, because once again, the really low-tech stuff can get through it, and equally people who are really, really good at the old hacking and coding and stuff can overcome it.
But there's not even any education out there.
Yeah.
There's nothing.
Yeah.
When the regulations came out, there was a bit of media hype, but there's no regular education.
But that's why I say,
and a lot of people will be law abiding
yeah.
if they would understand what they need to do, but there's nothing out there.
Yeah, and that's why I say one of the key things, even if there's no, extra, delegation or anything, someone needs to write this unmanned aircraft user code in the same way the road code's written. So a 15-year-old can understand it, and people know how to check with it. And actually, a lot of the, like Airways has been really good. Like this whole AirShare thing makes some of these things easy to view. But if you don't even know of its existence or how to use it, then what's the point? So I think there is it could be done, but there just needs to be that.
How is it we can get advertisements on the television saying use your VHF radio if you're offshore, but we can't put an advert on TV saying use a drone sensibly? Why do we worry about tourists, and yet we can't put any notices up in airports?
That's what Isaac said earlier. Something needs to go wrong first before these things are being enforced. That's the problem.
And the problem is, if you do that, you miss out on all the economic benefit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's
But also, I
actually a
think that-
lot of parallels with any new technology. If you go back to the Model T Ford, what was what was the requirement for licensing? What were the road rules? What was the education and licensing? So it's the same thing again with a new technology and a different paradigm. Yeah.
No, definitely, and that's why I don't want to sound too critical. I actually feel sorry for the CAA that they've had all this stuff put on them when they don't have necessarily the resources to do it. And that's much like with new technologies. Cars came out, there was a new department that never used to exist. Same with aircraft. When they first came out, you could buy an aircraft at a certain point in time and fly it without any training. Even World War I pilots, or the British lectured on how well you could ride a horse. I mean, we've come a long way. Sorry?
Play tennis.
Play tennis, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of real nutty ideas. But, that's the sort of thing. We know what's clear is with Part 101 operators, we can't have rules the same way as what we do with manned aircraft, because these people aren't pilots or air traffic controllers or engineers, so they can't understand the rules. I think that's the biggest threat.
The other thing, though, is you've demonstrated just how many of these things there must be out there in the world. I mean, if you take a risk-based approach to what's actually happened so far, aren't you finding that there's virtually zero loss of life associated with aircraft crashing into these small drones?
Well, that's why I say you'd have to decide a risk-based approach where there's an exemption put down on the weight is primarily the biggest determinant for the aircraft.
What happens if one goes down an intake?
Yeah,
Well, not a lot, really, when you think about it. I mean,
I suppose that they're designed to take a frozen chicken, aren't they?
That's right.
That's exactly why the rate restrictions came in.
Yeah, so that's why, like say the FAA doesn't say, you know, if you buy, like you probably get away with the Seamer X5. I mean, that's probably a reasonable type of aircraft you should be able to buy without having to register it or be a registered operator. Because it, yeah,
Just go straight through the tier 1.
that was the first one I bought. It was nuts trying to fly it.
It was terrible.
Any gust of wind.
That's what
Bear in
happened to
mind, no
mine.
fatalities. 72 million aircraft movements last year, and not a single instance of one hitting a drone anywhere in the world.
And it comes
I
down
think
to
that
it comes down to this, you know, malicious intent, I suppose.
Yeah.
Who wants to use this technology for malicious intent, or you know, like the equivalent of a boy racer with a, you know, with a drone.
I think that there has been cases, very, very near misses, but it's primarily been small aircraft. You see, like you say, it's malicious intent. If you're operating next to Auckland International Airport, the drone, then clearly you are someone who's just trying to be messing with the whole system. But the example I had of an aircraft model, you know, an unmanned aircraft operating at a height that could quite reasonably be on the approach path into Foxton Aerodrome is a different case. And you see what a 2 kilogram aircraft does to a Cessna 152. I don't know. That's probably, yeah. And that's the thing. There's actually been a whole lot. So you can read it. There's this big report. There's people literally, I don't know how much money they must have had to have these phantom aircraft, essentially, you know, the DJI Phantoms in the beginning of the presentation. And they actually had it being hit by different aircraft at different speeds and looked at what damage it did. They also did damage to dummies and stuff to see.
It's the Dayton University
high.
study.
Sorry?
Dayton University.
Might
They
have been.
crashed a drone into a Mooney wing.
No, there's one that was a bit more systematic. I can't remember where it was done now, but I mean, I can send you anything I've got if you want to have a look at it. But because that's the same argument we use with like the parachute thing. With, well, you should be we can safely operate above people without their consent because a parachute will deploy, which means even if it hits someone, the energy released is low enough, it's not going to seriously injure them. And that's what I mean about just, you know, but that's part 102 really, when we're talking about that. And that's the thing, all the serious uses at the moment are regulated, but I think the thing where the risk lies is just with the recreational operators who operate bigger ones, like I say, so it's not going to be the real small ones that are big enough, can fly high enough that they could interfere. And it's not going to be, you know, the airliners that are really going to suffer. It'll be someone who's a recreational pilot going out for a Saturday flight and coming into land. Yeah, helicopter's another big one.
I was going to say a helicopter that goes to a hospital.
Yeah, yeah.
That'd be somewhere like French Joseph.
Mm.
Guarantee it.
Yeah.
It'll be high density helicopter operations and
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
tourist who doesn't know the rules at all, who just comes to the country with a drone and they'll be flying it in the valley and they'll just take a helicopter.
The number of people I saw breaking the rules when I went on holiday down
Yeah.
the South Island was phenomenal. But like none of them were kind of risky enough that I bothered to, and they didn't look like they spoke English. But they were still, you know, the Wanaka tree. Like there was 3 people flying drones over like 100 people who wanted to see it. I had my Indonesian mother-in-law there. I'm not interested in the Wanaka tree for reference, but you know, there was 3 people operating that over 100 people without their permission. You know, like they weren't really doing anything dangerous, but that's an example of out of ignorance, they've broken the rules theoretically. Yes.
On a similar note, I was in Queenstown a few months ago and saw some people flying unshielded relatively near to the airport.
Yeah.
Definitely within controlled airspace. And how do you think these sort of suggestions you made, like in terms of registration, how would those apply for tourists? Like would the tourists be getting their learner's license before they can start flying their drones?
Well, I mean, whether you go the license and registration route or not, I think the most important thing is the recommendation to write something in easy language, simple language to understand. And maybe if you then had that translated into a few of the key languages, say Mandarin, Spanish, French, whatever, and make sure that they have that. Because at customs, you have to go through a special thing if you bring an unmanned aircraft overseas. I don't know why, but there seems to be this sort of thing about like, oh, you're carrying any unmanned aircraft, whatever. And
Perhaps we could get them to drive on the left-hand side of the road first.
yeah. There are other transport concerns, of course. But you know, if they're carrying that, you just be like, oh, here's a booklet. You know, just have a quick look at this. And it's about that safety promotion thing. I think is the biggest thing. The registering of the unmanned aircraft and doing the theory tests, you would, like say, have to have some boundaries on that, so it's not too burdensome.
Right.
Certainly, tourists, you'd be like, right, we can you could quickly tag that. Be like, $5, we'll tag that. Here's an information brochure. Go ahead. You're cleared to do this for the next month or something, 3
Yeah.
months. Just make it easy for them.
How dangerous is it letting tourists come in and drive on the road in a car?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Well, it's obviously very.
but I mean, the public have also raised concerns about that a number of
Yeah.
times too. But also,
But
there's
at
no,
the end of the day, it's the fatalities that drive the education process. And I think what you're trying to say is that let's get the education out there before the fatalities occur.
Yeah.
And it's an obvious recommendation, but who takes the driving seat, behind all the education that's done after a fatality? Is the government. So isn't MB or somebody like that
Yeah.
likely to be the department
Well,
that would have to take this up?
I've been in touch with those sorts of places, but they really aren't. It's definitely that reaction, especially MB. Obviously really excited for the economic benefit. Less regulations, better. We get more investment, all this sort of stuff. But that's what I say. Is as long as it's not burdensome regulation, I'd also suggest liberalising Part 102 a little bit. I didn't put that in the presentation; it's a bit harder to understand. But I get a lot of one-man operators who want me to write a 50-page document for them, and you just go, this is a bit excessive for operating a Phantom 4 in controlled airspace or something like that. And I know Australia brought out, they have 2 categories of commercial operators. So aircraft below a certain weight, doing very particular things, don't actually need to have a certificate, be a certificated operator. They just need to have done a course and got their badge. And so there are cases too where we could liberalise some areas that are not super high risk, because there's a big difference between, say, agricultural spraying with a 25-kilogram drone and someone taking photos with a Phantom 4. So I think what we need is a better risk-based approach.
But the work that we've done within both the society and CAA and indeed MB has actually created a bit of a groundswell of interest. So the symposium that the Aero Society ran 3 or 4 years ago, it was it was the biggest symposium we've ever had. Over 200 people attended because we were talking about UAVs. And it was phenomenal. And the response was absolutely outstanding. And some of the presentations that we had about how you're going to use unmanned vehicles for agricultural and various other uses was phenomenal. So at that stage, the government recognised that there was a growth industry occurring. But I think the education has started. We're here tonight. Part of the education, the work you're doing, I think, is exactly the same.
Yeah, and I think the enforcement as well, we talked about enforcement and how is it possible, but if we take Andrew's point about the risk-based approach to enforcement, you could say that if, for example, drones are operated within a controlled airspace or something, people get bigger fines or are punished harder than if they do something that is beyond the rules in a low risk area, for example, and you could change the punishment in that way as well.
Well, it's the same with like speeding fines and stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an example like the Wanaka Tree Chinese tourists. They'd probably just warn them and be like, oh, you're not allowed to do that, and leave it at that. You probably wouldn't even bother fining them. But someone like that guy who was doing it near, down Foxton, where that's clearly a much bigger risk, you might be like, no, look, here's an infringement notice. And so I think, but the difficulty is we don't, do the police have the resources to do it? The CAA sure as hell don't.
No, but if say the regulation becomes more and more and it's taken more seriously, then there needs to be, you can put regulation in place, but if you don't enforce it, that they will not keep to the rules.
And that's the problem is I think, that I mean, how you solve it. I mean, look, this is a discussion point, but the problem is I feel like a lot of New Zealanders just avoiding having the discussion. And I really am worried because I speak to pilots, especially. I know there's pilots in the room, but commercial pilots are honestly the worst when it comes to talking about unmanned aircraft. Oh, we need to just ban them, those bloody pricks flying next to the runways, blah, 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 blah. And you're kind of going, well, do you really want that sort of response where you're stopping what is a very good economic way of solving a number of problems versus, or can we just meet somewhere sort of along the lines of a little bit of regulation to stop the.
Yeah, I think it starts with the conversations. I mean, and the education. I work for CAA in the sector risk profiling area, and there's certainly been conversations at the medium and large air transport sector risk profiling workshops. Also, during the helicopter and a small aeroplane Part 135 workshops. I mean, there's been some very interesting stories that have come out, and there have been outcomes that have been targeted to identify some of the risks that have been observed. I mean, I was sitting in one workshop with the helicopter guys, and if you're aware of helicopter operations around the glaciers on the west coast, I mean, you get a dozen helicopters flying a circuit there, and it all gets pretty interesting if a tourist suddenly decides to take a photo of the glacier from their, little RPAS and launch it out of the car park, you see, and then all these guys are scrambling to, get out of the way of this aircraft, because it doesn't do too good for a tail rotor if one gets anywhere near one of those things, so there's a risk. But to mitigate that risk, I mean, Air New Zealand got on board, and now for all inbound flights into New Zealand, there's you'll probably be aware of the RPAS videos on giving tourists a bit of a schooling on what the rules are in New Zealand when taking these photos. But equally, the airlines are looking for ways to mitigate the risk, because I mean, some of them are getting pretty big, pretty heavy, and they can do a hell of a lot of damage. Some of these things.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like I say, airshare is another good one where the safety promotions come out. But people so I had a friend in Singapore who was coming here for a holiday recently and was like, oh, do you know anything about, can I just bring my drone in and fly it? Wanted to take photos. And I found some good stuff on the airshare, but the fact that she couldn't find that herself from Googling on, in Singapore tells me that, well, there's something there. Now, this PhD educated person that's not no idiot, and that wasn't immediately obvious to them what the rules were around taking drones into New Zealand and operating them. So, but I mean, equally, people who buy them on AliExpress are going to have the same experience. So if we can have some way, the safety promotion is probably the biggest thing. And then you look at, do we still need some more regulation after that? That's probably the next bit. But I agree, the conversations are important. In New Zealand, we're very interested in the research we did back in 2015. They didn't believe that there'd be 500,000 operators by 2025, but they were still, when we pointed out some of the risks that it could pose to them, they were still quite interested, and their operations and integrity unit was sort of looking at different ways they could mitigate those risks. So
I would suggest a hell of a lot of that 50, whatever it was, 500,000.
Yeah.
It probably disappeared like Graham's did, So
It's just a drone.
they're just not there anymore, and they're gone, they're broken. They were
Well, I can get another one.
last week's toy,
yeah.
So it's probably not a real number. Certainly after a number of years, those early ones will be well and truly gone.
How advanced is the UTM system?
Yeah, well, that's another thing. There's no, and you mean in New Zealand?
No, not New Zealand, but they stopped the trial overseas, correct? They reckon they had it wrong. They're going back to the drawing board. So where are they at now?
So what is UTM?
It's the air traffic control.
Unmanned
Aircraft
traffic management or something like that.
That's the
Yeah.
low level one. They tried it here for a while, but it was NASA were involved in everything, weren't they? NASA and a few others were involved, and they pulled the plug on it. They went wrong.
AirMap are trialing in several countries, USA, Switzerland, Norway. But essentially they're running an airspace blocking system. It just blocks off lumps of airspace. It doesn't actually track the aircraft.
Well, the one that NASA were doing, the UTM one, was actually trying to track it and use it. There was going to be a handoff at about, I forget how many feet and everything else. And
There is like
it didn't work.
USB that can be fitted to drones.
Yeah. Well, that's when I talked about the beyond visual line of sight, fully autonomous ones. They've all got ADS-B and that sort of stuff integrate in. But ICAO has got a few working groups on this, and one of them specifically on UTM. And you're right, they've come back to the drawing board a little bit, but they are obviously making some progress. They seem to be releasing interim reports fairly regularly. And eventually the idea is that they will come out with something to be proposed, probably become an annex to the Convention on Civil Aviation. I think we're up to Annex 19 or something at the moment, or Safety Management Systems, I think it is. So we'll get Annex 20 on unmanned aircraft or something like that, and then we'll have a good standardized approach across the world. And that is the other side of it, is ICAO may beat us to it in terms of recommending what to do with recreational operators and where the lines are. But it seems to be a very difficult thing because every country has a different perspective. And certainly those that have been very liberal in their regulations, like Rwanda and Vanuatu, have benefited immensely from how the technology has been used to deliver things to remote areas and things like that. So there's a real trade-off here. There's no sort of right or wrong answer. But if you're going to pick on the current system at all, those are the things to pick on. If you're happy with the current system, that's fine. But now everyone has a bit of an idea. Oh, that's, yes, sorry.
Do you know if AirShare is being actively like worked on or improved?
Very much so, yes.
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Because that's one thing. Like my friend bought a drone and posted some videos on YouTube flying out of Newlands, and my parents live at the top of Woodridge, and I know that jets come in parallel to their house, right? So flying out of Newlands, it'd be right in the flight line. And I said to him, dude, you can't fly there. One, it's Class C, it's restricted airspace down to the ground, and also the planes fly directly over there. And he said, well, like, you know, you look on AirShare or something like that, but the whole of Wellington's covered by this block, and it sort of doesn't really give you a good representation, because according to that, he can't fly anywhere in Wellington without being shielded operation, which he shouldn't. But you can also understand from his point of view, not having any idea about aviation, and sort of looking at it and going, oh, well, they think you can't fly anywhere in Wellington, and that there's planes flying overhead everywhere.
Well, that's what I mean about the making it easy to understand. And I agree, AirShare can be improved to better manage that, I think. And also, is it right that they shouldn't be? The other thing, actually, I know you mentioned shielded areas, which we come across quite a lot, is what is a shielded area? Because people aren't sure if it means an area that shields manned aircraft from the unmanned aircraft, or an area that shields manned aircraft from the unmanned aircraft. So if that makes sense, so it could be either way. And the interpretation of that doesn't seem to be very consistent. I.e., if you've got a row of trees that would stop the aircraft blowing somewhere where it shouldn't go, or is the fact that there's one tree there mean you can operate up to that height sort of within close proximity to the tree? And there's no real standardized idea or even something like that. So yeah, lots of fun. But AirShare, I think the Airways and CA have been throwing quite a bit of money that way, and they've been, like they promote ads on Facebook and stuff like that. So there is good work happening, but we just need to make it easy for normal people to go, yep, cool, I can fly my toy here, and then we'll be in a good place.
One last question. We've done it. We've cracked it. Look at that, and it's just on 7. Wow. As far as I'm concerned, Isaac, I think what you've done is you've delineated the Part 101 and the Part 1 and 2 operators very clearly. I've been well educated tonight. By not just yourself, but by the other participants in the room. So thank you all for your contribution. I think it's been a very valuable presentation and discussion. What do we take away from this is I think that New Zealand is actively pursuing how we can safely manage unmanned aerial vehicles. And we're recognizing that there's a lot of passionate novices out there who we want them to be passionate, but we want them to understand. So I think some of the work that you're proposing is of great value. So thank you very much for your presentation tonight.
I'll leave some business cards here too. And if anyone ever does want to be a serious operator, we do have courses that run for 2 or 3 days on the same subject.
And you will write their procedures in your spare time.
Pretty good. Well, I can do that consulting.
Will you put that picture up on this?